to this webinar of Höcker on the NOW program, the second NOW program. NOW actually is a abbreviation for the Dutch tijdelijke noodmaatregel overbrugging voor werkgelegenheid. NOW is short for that measure. In English, it's basically an emergency measure to bridge employment. We have organized several webinars over the past weeks, and some of you have attended those webinars, first on the general employment aspects on the coronavirus, such as working from home, what to do as an employer, what not to do. At some point, at a point in time, the first NOW program entered into force, and we've organized a webinar on that program as well. Recently, the second tranche, so the second installment of NOW has been communicated, and we thought it would be a good idea to share the details of that program with you as well. With me in this room is my colleague Mick at a safe 1.5 meters distance. What we will be doing is we'll be discussing with you the first installment of the NOW, because it had several adjustments in the course of time. So we'll give you an overview of the first program, also because that's still the basis for the second installment. Milk will be handling, or will be discussing the first installment. I will then take over and discuss the second one, so that will be effective as from July. Then Mick will look at some other new support measures introduced by our government. And of course, there's room for questions. There is also not only at the end of the webinar room for questions, but also in the course of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please use the chat. I think probably you've all used Zoom before, but I'll share a short message with you so you see that popping up. Here is the chat, so you see something in your screen. If you simply send the questions to all panelists and attendees, we will see it as well. And then we'll try to answer your question when the topic arises. All right, I will be moving over some 2 meters to the right, and I'll now introduce you to my colleague Mick, who will be discussing the first installment. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome again. Thanks for joining us at this webinar. I'll have a look with you on the NOW 1.0, and it's the NOW 1.0, but there were 3 adjustments during the course of the last 2 months, and I will discuss them all with you. As Martijn explained, it's still the basis. It will be still the basis for the NOW 2.0. So let's have a look at the NOW 1.0. It was adopted at the end of March, and the purpose of the NOW 1.0 at the end of March 2020 was to obtain a robust scheme that would be applicable to all employers in the Netherlands. No exceptions would be made, as this would impede the robustness of the scheme. The intention was to compensate employers for the wage cost so that the salary of the employees could remain at the same level as before this crisis. So it was a robust scheme, no exceptions would be made. That was intended, but later on it was clear that it was necessary to make some adjustments, and we will get into those adjustments. So what again were the general principles of the NOA, the NOW 1.0 at the end of March 2020? The initial NOA consisted of a 90% contribution of the wage cost calculated on the loss of turnover of the employer, and the turnover will be calculated on a period of 3 months. The scheme, the NOA, included a method for calculating the loss of turnover. The company have to compare the chosen period of 3 months, and the chosen period may be May to March, April to June, or May to July, with a quarter of the turnover of 2019. The contribution consisted of a comparison of the wage sum of January 2020 comparing with the wage sum of March to May 2020. And the idea behind that is that the employer would remain employment intact within the company, so that the wage sum of March to May will not be dropped, will not be less or lower than the wage sum of January. But it was mostly the other way around. So a lot of, or not mostly, but a lot of companies, they had an increased wage bill in March to May 2020, which had a negative impact on their subsidy. For instance, the beach bar owners who do not have any subsidy, wage sum in January, but also employers who gave their on-call workers fixed hour contract based on the WAP, the new legislations which entered into force at the beginning of 2020, or just a company who anticipated on growth for 2020 and hired new people, let's say in February or March, and then had a higher wage sum in March to May than in January, which had a negative impact on the subsidy. So that was one of the main issues that popped up directly, and of which the legislator said in the beginning, well, we are not going to do anything about it, and later on they made some adjustments to the NOA for this purpose. Before we have a look at it, what's the range of the NOA 1.0 in the Netherlands? Now, at the moment of speaking, around 114,000 companies and organizations with a total of approximately 1.9 employees make use of the NOW. So that's a rough calculation is estimation is that 20% of the employees are supported, of the wage costs are supported by the NOA at the moment. The other support measurements is the TOSO, around 347 self-employed people are subsidized by the TOSO, and more than 700 million has been paid out to companies which were eligible for the TOGS, that's the €4,000 compensation for fixed costs. So a lot of companies benefit from this support measures, which indicates how important it has been that this support measures has been adopted. The first change was at the 3rd of April 2020. It was an adjustment to the calculation of the dismissal fine has been adopted, and now Martijn will explain a little bit more about the dismissal fine in the NOA 2.0, but in the initial scheme, the dismissal fine was not adopted correctly because it was there was a correction for the turnover, and that's has been removed quickly because then it made the dismissal fine less effective. So no correction for the turnover anymore after a couple of days after the first adoption of the NOA. The UWV extended their decision period for the definitive subsidy. So instead of after 22 weeks after applying for the subsidy, now the decision period has been extended to 52 weeks. At the beginning, it was not possible if a company had a foreign bank account number to apply for the NOA, and that has been fixed in the NOA 1.2. And an important addition is that employers have to explain at an application at the UWV for dismissals why the NOA is not sufficient to or is not an appropriate alternative for the employer instead of having redundancies. So there's an extra explanation needed if the company is going to start a UWV process, why this NOA scheme, the NOA subsidy, is not an alternative or sufficient alternative for the company instead of having redundancies. So just after a couple of days, the first adjustments were already made. Some other adjustments were a month later. The main adjustment is that the turnover determination at groups was changed after after the NOA 1.2. Also, individual operating companies within a group can apply for the NOA. Before this change, it had to be determined at the group level what the loss of turnover was for the entire group. And after this change, the NOA is also open for operating companies, which is not a personal company. So not only personal employees may be in that company, that it has to be a real operating company. Before an individual operating company within a group can apply for the NOA, an agreement with the unions or with staff representation, if there are less than 20 employees, have to be reached about the job retention within that company. Also, a statement must be submitted by the group, by the mother company or the group head, that there will be no bonuses or profit distributions to the management or the executive board for 2020. This obligation is also returning in the NOA 2.0, which Martijn will discuss. And it's also not allowed to repurchase stock, shares, or to pay out dividends to shareholders in 2020. And it's important that the total group loss, turnover loss for the group, may not exceed 20%, because if that's the situation, then the NOA has to be applied for the full group. So it's only open for individual operating companies which have a turnover loss of more than 20%, whilst the group has a lower turnover loss, so below 20%. The UWV had to, is going to distribute public money, and therefore have to anticipate on requests for the WOP, that's the Public Access Act. This could potentially conflict with the business competition sensitive information contained in a NOA application. That's why it has been decided that the automatic consent given by the companies at the application for the NOA is also is only limited to the information that is necessary for transparency based on the Public Access Act. So not competitive or company sensitive information will be published. The UWV will start publishing information at the end of June on the website. Furthermore, it was decided in an NOA 1.2 that no obligation anymore to mention wage subsidy. At first it was thought, well, if there's also already a wage subsidy for an employee, then for that employee the NOA cannot be applied for. But then it was considered that it was too much of a burden for the UWV to decide on the individual cases, so that has been removed. So companies who have someone employed for who they receive a wage subsidy, it's also allowed to apply for the NOA for that employee. So you can include the wage of that employee in the total wage costs. Also, if that means that the companies subsidized twice for that employee. So the third NOA, so the NOA 1.3, the third changes were adopted at the same time as the letter was received about the NOA 2.0. So a lot of attention has been focused on the NOA 2.0 last week, but there are still some changes which are relevant for this NOA package 2. So that's the NOA 1.3. The main change is that there is a new calculation for wages for seasonal businesses. The change for seasonal businesses mean that there's an increase in the wage. If there's an increase in the wage bill in March to May 2020, that this can be included in the calculation of the final subsidy when determined. So not for the advance payment, but the final subsidy when determined. So that might be somewhere in September next year. So not for the upfront payment. What it's necessary that the wage bill in the period of March to May 2020 is higher than 3 times the wage bill of January. In this calculation method, the amount of the wage bill in the months of April and May will always be maximized on the wage bill of March. So this means that if any company which has had an increased wage bill from March to May 2020 comparing to January 2020 will be compensated for this at determining the final subsidy. So it's probably somewhere around the end of next year. So that's an improvement for companies who had no salary or low salary wage bill in January, or for companies who have hired new people after January and experienced an increased wage bill. They will be compensated for that at the final subsidy calculation. There was also directly a problem for companies who acquired another company after the 1st of January 2019, because the turnover of that company was not included or not fully included for the year 2019, while now in 2020 there's at least some turnover to be expected of that company. So that means that for the applicant, it had a negative impact if they acquired the company last year, because there's now turnover within that new company, which was not there yet in 2019. So there's a new calculation method for companies who acquired a company last year, and that new calculation method is that after the month of the acquisition, it's then calculated from that moment till the end of February 2020, and that amount is pro rata calculated for a period of 3 months, and for that for that turnover is included in the calculation for the NOA 1.3 for the NOA in 2020. So if you have acquired a company in 2019, which had a negative impact on the subsidy in 2020, then the new calculation method makes that ensures that the company is not punished by the fact that it acquired the company last year or beginning of this year. It's also possible that the company was acquired after January 2020, which also had a negative impact on the wage sum. And then the same calculation method as I explained before for the seasonal businesses will be applied. So if your company acquired a company after January 2020, which meant an increase of the wage sum of March to May, then it's also allowed to use the method of the seasonal business wage sum for your company. So if that's been the case, then it's still possible to apply for the NOA based on these new rules for the NOA 1.0. Some of the companies also paid a 13th month in January, which led to an increased wage bill in January, and that 13th month will be filtered out by the UWV at the moment the final subsidy will be determined. So if your company paid out the 13th month in January, which does not reflect the actual employment costs of the company, because that was a one-time payment for employees, but not the real salary for the employees in the month January, that will be filtered out at defining the final subsidy by the UWV. Due to these new rules, the application period has been extended till the 5th of June of this year. So instead of the 31st of May. The last main adjustment is that the threshold for the auditor's report has been published. If the company or the group will receive a total subsidy, or expected total subsidy of 125,000 euros plus, which corresponds with upfront payment of 100,000 euros, then an auditor report needs to be added to the subsidy application. So that's important if your company or the group of the companies will apply for a subsidy over 125,000 K, then the auditor's report will need to be provided. The UWV gave some numbers about this based on the first 113,000 applications, and approximately 10% of those applications applicants will receive an expected subsidy of 125,000 euros or more, and those 10% of the companies they will receive 66% of the total advance. So yeah, as always, a small portion of the companies will receive the main portion of the total subsidy. If your company will most likely receive a subsidy of more than 25,000 euros, then a third party needs to confirm the loss of turnover, and this third party statement may be given by a financial service provider, a branch organization, or an administrative office. And please be aware that the Ministry of Social Affairs can random check if an auditor's report would have been necessary. The last adjustment that was made was the date of the application determination. It's decided that if a company applies for the now 1.0 and also for the now 2.0, that it may file for the final subsidy application after the 7th of September of this year. And then it needs to be done within 26 weeks. And then after applying for the final subsidy determination, then the UWV has 52 weeks to decide on the final subsidy, which means that not before September next year, most likely the UWV will decide what the final subsidy will be for the company. This was it for the NOA 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. It's still open to apply for the NOA till the 5th of June, so make use of it if these new recent adjustments might open up the possibility for your company to apply for the NOA, because it's still open. And otherwise, it's important to have in mind that the NOA 1.0 to 1.3 will still form the basis of the NOA 2.0, which Martijn will now discuss with you.
Yes. So the now, yeah, let me talk about the now. That's easier for me than NOA. Now 2.0. First of all, when the previous the now 0.0 1.0 was introduced, we had a detailed arrangement, so basically an act saying with articles of the now in place, detailed arrangement, so that we could inform you really in full on the ins and outs. Presently, on the now 2.0, we only have a letter to Parliament by Minister Koolmees. That letter is, although extensive, it's not that detailed, so there are some blanks and some loose ends. So it's important to take into account that we do expect the detailed arrangement to be published soon, but that can deviate a little from what we have now. There are a couple of topics that I will go through in a minute. That we expect to be fleshed out in the detailed arrangement. Let me start off with hold on. So let me start off with the target of the now 2.0. It's still the aim of this now arrangement is still to make it possible for employers with a turnover drop of at least 20% to keep as many employees as possible employed. You can submit an application for the now 2.0 from July 6 to 20, and that's an aim, right? And it has to do with the workload of the UWV. So it's this is a big project for the government, and the UWV that you probably also know about because that's the institution that handles dismissal requests, that handles unemployment benefits. That is the only institution that is able or that is authorized to handle the applications to the now arrangement, and that's it's a lot of work. So they aim to make it possible to apply as per the 6th of July. So make previously informed you that applying to the now 1.0 is still possible until the 5th of June. Then you have a month, a gap of a month, and then there is then you can apply to the second installment. So what wages are subsidized? Which period will it cover? This covers the periods of June, July, and August. And then, of course, you know that. The second question is how is the turnover calculated? Because of course the subsidy, as in now 1.0, is based on a decline of turnover, and under the first installment, the basis was March, April, May, and you could start with March, or you could start in April, you could start in May. For 2.0, the 3-month period starts at June 1st, July 1st, or August 1st. If you applied in the first tranche, the now 0.0, the period must be in connection with the reference period from the first tranche. So, say you've applied to now 1.0, and you took March, April, and May as a basis for the decline in turnover. Then you should apply to, if you apply to now 2.0, you should use June, July, and August as your reference periods. You cannot choose another period than that because it has to be in connection with each other. What will then be the reference month? And then I'm talking about the reference month for the wage bill. What will be the wage bill that will be the basis for the subsidy? Well, that will be March instead of January, and that's beneficial for a lot of companies, mainly because prior to the crisis, economy went well, and a lot of companies had a bigger wage sum in March than they had in January. Yeah, for instance, because of scale-ups, because of new hires. So it's good to see that there will be another reference month for the wage bill that will increase the subsidy for a lot of companies. Do you also have to apply to the first installment in order to be eligible to apply for the second installment? No, you can choose to apply to both of them or one of them. So it's not you don't have to apply. You didn't have to apply to 1.0 in order to be able to apply for 2.0. When will then the subsidy be determined? So the definitive application can only be made after a period to which a subsidy relates. So in this case, if you would, the subsidy relates to June, July, and August, you can only apply beyond August. And to avoid overlapping of the application and the determination process, determination of the first period, so March, April, and May, can be requested from 7th September 2020. So you have to distinguish between requesting for the advance payment, right? It can be done for the second installment as per the 6th of July, and the request for the definitive subsidy, right? Because it's the advance payment is based on an estimation, and the definite the request for the definite subsidy is based on the actual decline of turnover. So if you've applied to 1.0, you can request for the definite subsidy as from 7th September, and the dates for applying for the subsidy in the second period, so that's the final subsidy, that will be announced as soon as possible, but it will be after the 7th of September, of course. But again, from the 6th of July onwards, you can apply for the advance payment, which is of course important. It does mean that because of the fact that the definitive determination of the first tranche can be done, or you can apply to that as from the 7th of September. Subsequently, a period of decision period of 52 weeks applies. So the UWV can take up to a year to take a decision on the final determination, right? So if you apply for your for the final determination of the now 1.0 at 8 September, you'll be one of the first, of course. Yeah, then it can take up to a year, so it can be September to 21 for the final calculation to be made, and also for the final payment to be made. And that's, I think this is a bit of a pity, to say the least, in case you've asked for an advance payment based on a conservative decline in turnover, so say 30% decline in turnover. If your actual decline in turnover is say 60%, there's a huge difference. And if you're a big company, it can be, the difference of subsidy can be significant, and you'd have to wait for your for the difference for over a year. So that's that's something, especially in case the company is a bit in trouble. That's something that you may not be able to handle as a company without requesting for an actual additional loan, for instance. But it's something to be aware of, and also something to perhaps if you apply for the second installment, don't be too conservative in applying or estimating your turnover decline. But it's better to receive a big amount upfront and just take into account that you may have to repay a little, than to wait a long time for the difference to be paid to you in case you've estimated your decline in turnover too conservatively. So what are the changes then in 2.0? The biggest one is that as the our government said the cancellation of the dismissal fine. So the now 1.0 included the clause of submitting a dismissal application and not withdrawing it within 5 working days with the UWV. It led to a reduction of the subsidy by basically the salary of the employee concerned over that period, plus a fine of 50% over that amount. And that fine is no longer an issue under now 2.0. Our cabinet wants to prevent bankruptcies as much as possible, and is aware of the fact that employers may have to apply to the now, as well as at the same time or simultaneously execute dismissals. But this is there are still consequences to submitting for dismissal under now 2.0, and I will get to this topic in more detail a little bit later. Another topic that is relevant is that there will be a ban of bonuses to board and directors in over 220 when applying to the now 2.0. Now caused some the first installment caused some upheaval when bigger companies, such as Booking, applied to the now, and simultaneously they were also granting bonuses to employees, to the board of directors. This has led to a motion by Jetten from party D66, on which basis the bonuses over 220 may not be paid when applying to now 2.0. I also address this topic a little bit in more detail as well, because that's still that this raises some questions that are not fully addressed in the letter of comments. Again, another relating topic is that there will be a prohibition to buy back own shares as companies. Company that buys back shares from shareholders and thus reduces its capital. This is not allowed, and companies must build up a cash position and build a buffer to secure employment within the company. This will be further elaborated in the final arrangement, so this is really addressed shortly in the letter, but the details of this prohibition will be communicated later. Then there will be an effort to for a training effort for employers in relation to employees. So the government knows this considers this crisis to be very impactful, and is aware of the fact that some employees may have to retrain themselves in order to find employment that is in demand. I see a question popping up. Let's see. Does it ban bonuses to employees also? Now I will get to the actual arrangement on the ban of bonuses in I think 10 minutes. So I will address this topic in more detail in a moment. Back to this training effort. So government says, okay, it is likely that people may have to reschool themselves, retrain themselves to find employment that is in demand after the crisis or within the crisis. Employees should be given the opportunity, and by opportunity I mean time, by employers to seek development advice to what kind of job they should reschool themselves or to train for job retention. Training itself, so the actual offering training to employees to reschool themselves to find other employment, is not part of the now. It's not an obligation, not an employer's obligation under the now 2.0. But the effort to give employees time and opportunity to retrain themselves, that is. There is, the government says, well, the works councils would have a signaling function in this respect, so they would know about the obligation. The idea behind it is that the works council will get into contact with the employer to discuss how to execute this, this best effort obligation within the company. And of course, that applies to companies that have a works council installed. Not every company has a works council installed, but it's the idea is that you would discuss with your employees if this would be applicable to them. Simultaneously, the government has made 50 million available for a package that they call the Netherlands Continues to Learn. 50 million is not that much. It may sound like a lot of money, but in my view, it's relatively low amount. But the idea is that employees, as well as independent contractors, can apply to this arrangement and retrain themselves in the period between July and the end of 2020. This still has to be organized, how this is done, but the idea is that they can apply for development advice. So basically, more or less advice looking at the background of the employee, the competences, to what kind of employment would be suitable, where is the demand in employment, what can you still do, and then online training to offer, so that the government will finance online training for those employees. So again, it's for employers. They don't have to finance this online training or the development advice. They have to provide opportunity to the employees so that they can do this, that they can obtain this advice and enter into this online training program. So it's offering time. It's not uncommon in some cases to offer employees actual schooling. In most cases, this currently has to do with schooling that is aimed at retaining employment within the company. If you now look at this new obligation to offer people time to basically look for to reschool themselves, you may consider to offer employees schooling, despite the fact that it's not your obligation to do so. And why? Well, this could be relevant in case you have to reorganize, you have to basically fire people, and you may avoid that by basically offering people to a schooling package whereby they can find other employment themselves. And what you can also consider to do is to say, okay, we will offer you this schooling. It will cost us 5,000 euros. And we will now agree that we will finance this schooling program, but we will be setting it off against any and all transitional payments at the end of the contract. So that if the employee has gone through the schooling program and still has not found other employment, you have to fire the employee, then you can set off this 5,000 euros against the transitional compensation. This is something that you have a number of conditions apply to this, and the most important one is that you agree with the employee upfront that such a set off will take place. There are a couple of other conditions. So if you would want to execute this within your company, do reach out. We have templates available for this. Let me see. Changes there. Sometimes this spreadsheet does not cooperate in case we use it within Zoom. So there it goes. Okay. Seasonal work adjustments. That's the next change within the now 2.0. The month of March will be used as a reference month, and of course, again, as discussed, this is favorable for employees where January is a month with lower wages. This was intended to accommodate companies that have seasonal work, but in our practice, we see that it's relevant for scale-ups and successful companies as well that now feel the impact of the crisis, but before the crisis, we were quite successful. Then there is an increase in the subsidy factor, the multiplier, that is now 40%. And let me explain this a little. Again, how is the subsidy calculated? The definitive data on the decline of turnover forms the basis, and it gives a certain percentage of decline related to the data for 2019, of course. Then the wage bill for June, July, August is taken. Social insurance wages from current employment, that is multiplied by 0.9 and the percentage of turnover decline. Right? This is quite mathematic, but the idea is that the subsidy is not only this 90% of the turnover decline, but it's multiplied under the now 1.0 by 1.3. Why is it 1.3 under 1.0? That is to accommodate employers that, of course, also besides the gross monthly salary, also have to deal with the holiday allowance, pension premiums, social security premiums. So there are a lot of costs in addition to the gross monthly salary, and the factor 1.3 aims to basically subsidize those costs as well. But 1.3 was considered to be on the low end. It depended per employer what kind of cost they had. But in all cases, in the majority of cases, 1.3 simply was too low. So under the now 2.0, there will be a multiplier of 1.4, which means that basically the subsidy will be higher. Mick already discussed the auditors' reports when they will be required, so I will skip this topic, but of course that will apply to both 1.0 as well as 2.0. Now the bonuses, because this is one of the topics that is that still raises questions. I'll share with you what we know presently. So what's the purpose behind the ban on bonuses? The idea is that companies must build up a cash position, and that the subsidy provides companies with space and room that should not be used to pay bonuses. Of course, this is quite political, and it was this was introduced after the upheaval that I discussed 5 minutes ago. So who does the ban apply to and to who not? The ban applies to in Dutch, bestuur and directie. And if you would have to translate it in English, you could say management and boards, statutory boards. It doesn't apply to employees who have a bonus scheme as part of their compensation package, that are not no part of the management and board. So, for instance, if you have sales employees, sales managers that have that part of their wages are dependent upon their results, you're still obliged to pay those bonuses to those employees. The terms management and board have not yet been elaborated. It's not something that is there's no list on what the arrangement does not actually explain what this means and who is part of management and board and who not. I expect that the government will basically work this out in the actual arrangement, and that we will have to that they will use some definition like the top executives within an organization. So that's like a little bit broader than management and board. But if you would use top executives and for instance the people who have the highest authority over the labor in an organization, then it gets to be a little bit more concrete. So to what periods does this apply? This applies to 220 up to and including the shareholders meeting at which the annual accounts are adopted for 220. Does not apply to 219. So any bonuses paid employees that are board of directors that are eligible to bonuses for their efforts in 2019, that can still be paid. The idea is if you receive now 2.0, you cannot pay bonuses for that this specific year. So what is meant by a bonus? Then that's something Q asked to within. I think you phrased the question to all panelists, but not to all attendees. But Q asked, does it ban bonuses to employees also? No, it doesn't ban bonuses to the, I would say, normal employees or the sales managers. That's where they are still eligible to bonus payments. Which type of bonuses are banned? All kinds of bonuses are banned. So it's what the letter of comment says. It applies to bonuses and also profit distributions. It doesn't say exactly what kind of bonus. If you would look, what's commonly considered to be a bonus is that has to do with something on top of the gross salary, depending on the efforts of the employee. So normally the salary, of course, is due regardless of the results of an employee. So it's basically, if you simply show up at work, you'll be eligible to your salary as an employee. A bonus is dependent on the actual efforts made and results made. That can be a discretionary bonus, that can be a commission scheme. Again, this is not explicitly stated what does include and doesn't include, what is included and isn't included. So we expect this to be, hopefully it will be worked out in a definitive arrangement. So it's the common bonus payments, but it's also profit sharing. So dividend paid to shareholders, but also profit sharing by employees, because employees they don't have to be a shareholder to be eligible to profit sharing. You can offer the employees a scheme where they are eligible to a certain percentage of the profits. Similar, Bas asked, seasonality was seen from a labor perspective, but what about revenue seasonality? When you are working towards an event in, say, September, and you already know the revenues will be heavily down, then you can, then it depends, of course, Bas, to what periods you have, did you apply to the now 1.0? Because that limits your choice in relation to choosing the revenue decline period for 2.0. Because if the event takes place in September, if you've applied to now 1.0, and then you can't take September into account. If you haven't applied to 1.0, then you can choose the months where you would expect a heavy decline. You could include September, right? Because it's, again, if you apply to 1.0, and if you use March, April, May as the months of the decline of turnover, then you have to use June, July, August, and you cannot choose September. But if you haven't, or if you choose other months under 1.0, then you can. Yeah, you can apply. Second question for us: you can apply for future revenue losses. Yeah, it's an estimation, right? So these months that are taken into account, you don't know what will happen, right? So it's you make your best guess on which period the losses will be the heaviest. Back to the topic of bonuses. Then I already mentioned that buying back own shares is also not allowed. This is something that will also be more elaborated in more detail in the final arrangement. The threshold to this these obligations, they apply to companies that receive a subsidy for which an auditor's report is required. Nick already shared with you the thresholds to the auditor's reports. Then the biggest topic, if you ask me, the biggest restriction still, other than communicated, in our view, there still is a little bit of a fine if you would reorganize under the now 2.0. What you see in the screen is now the English translation of a part of the letter, Colmees, and I will just read along. In the settlement, the subsidy for dismissal applications for business reasons will no longer be adjusted for 150%, but for 100% by the amount of the wages of the employees for whom dismissal has been applied for. And this concerns then applications for dismissal that will be submitted in the period from 1st of June to 31st of August. So again, looking back at 1.0, now 1.0, you had this adjustment of the subsidy for 150%. So if you would say at a decline in turnover of 100%, you'd get 90% of that of the salaries compensated, and then there's a cap for the people who earn a lot of salary, so there's the cap of 9,500 euros applied to it as well. But the idea is that you get a subsidy, which is a part of the salary, right? So you never get full salary compensated. The fine then was 150%. What you get is then that if you would apply for dismissal and would not revoke the dismissal application within 5 days, the subsidy would be lowered with 150% of the salary of the employees concerned at that period, right? So you have 3 months with an employee earning 4,000 euros per month, 4,000 times 1.5 times 3, that roughly will be the penalty. Which is of course a big penalty because it's a lot more than the subsidy that you got for those employees. Under the now 2.0, there still is a consequence, right? Because if you would still have to pay, or if the reduction would still be 100% instead of 150%, you still have to pay back more than you got for those employees, right? So the idea is that you get a subsidy, which is a part of the salaries. If you then fire those employees based on economic reasons, then you have to repay 100% of those salaries covering the period of the subsidy. And just to make it more concrete for you, if you would apply for a termination permit in June, of course, the employment agreement will not be terminated the next day, right? There will still be a notice period. There will be a period that the UWV takes to process the application. So it's likely that termination of employment would take place as per the 1st of September, roughly, depending on the notice period. And then you'd still have to pay the transitional compensation and provide the employee with a final settlement. It's the bare minimum. If you would then at the same time apply to the now 2.0, effectively what will happen is that you have to continue paying those employees during the notice period. But you'd have to, and of course, have to pay the transitional compensation, etc. After termination. But you also be confronted with the payback of 100% of the wages in the context of the now 2.0. So that is a big consequence. Bigger, well, of course, it's better than 150%, but that's still, if you would ask me and ask Mick whether this is a actual cancellation of the dismissal fine, we say, well, we don't think so. There still is a fine attached to submitting an application for termination. In about half an hour, there will be a opportunity for us, for you as well, to ask questions to Colmees on this specific topic, on the now 2.0. We will be asking exactly this question, because if you communicate to the world, to the outside world, that the cancellation, that this dismissal fine will be cancelled, I think you should really do it, and you should be offering employers the full subsidy, at least for the period that the now 2.0 applies for. And if you would terminate employees beyond that period, so if you would, in this example, that I've just shared with you terminates an employee as per the 1st of September, in our view, you still have to be, you should be eligible to the now subsidy for June, July, August. But that's our view. You can concur with that. We will ask it what Thomas thinks about this, and I think we are not the only ones that have raised questions on this topic. So it may be that the government comes back from their standpoint, and that in the final arrangement there will actually be a cancellation of the dismissal fine. Let's hope so. Final note is that the other rules on termination of employment, such as the WMCO that is put on the sheet, that is the act that obliges you to inform the UWV as well as the unions on a collective dismissal of 20 persons or more within a time frame of 3 months. That still applies. All the other rules on termination of employment still apply. So there are the regulations of the UWV. There is, of course, the additional motivational requirement that you have to explain why, if you fire someone on basis of economic reasons, why you can't suffice with an application to the now 2.0, and why the situation is that bad that you have to fire someone. That still applies, right? So there's no deviations or adjustments made in the whole dismissal process. Right, this is it for the now 2.0. If you still have questions, do let us know. Mick will now go forth with the last topic of today, and that is the other support measures. Thank you.
So next to the NOA, there are several support measurements. Most of them are fiscally driven, so we will not go into detail of those support measurements. I will highlight 2 of the main support measurements for entrepreneurs, which are the TOSO and the new TVL MKB. I will start first with the TOSO and then to the TVL MKB. The TOSO is a temporary bridging scheme for self-employed persons, and it's the 2.0 version. It consists of two parts. It's a social benefits assistant and an assistance to meet working capital requirements. Most of the requirements of the TOSO 1.0 are still applicable, but there are a couple of adjustments which I will highlight now. What is still the same, it's open for all entrepreneurs, so self-employed entrepreneurs without personal, with personal, with staff, or a director major shareholder, a DGA, if he or she cannot pay his regular salary anymore out of the company. Some obligations are you have to comply with the hour criterion. It's a 1225 hours a day, hours a year, sorry. You have to use for your own company. Your registration of the company must be made before the March 17, 2020. That was applicable for the TOSO 1.0. It's not sure if that the same date will apply for the TOSO 2.0, but till now, at least for the TOSO 1.0, your company had to be registered before the March 17, 2020. The first TOSO included that the applicant should be resident and based in the Netherlands. 2 days ago, the day before yesterday, based on discussions in the parliament, it's now decided that also entrepreneurs who have their company in the Netherlands but are living just at the border in Belgium or Germany can also apply for the TOSO. There are some slight adjustments made to the income test. Now the company has to provide, or the entrepreneur has to provide a statement that there's no case of bankruptcy or of uitstel van betaling, so of a situation where the company cannot pay its debts anymore. So that's a statement that needs to be given for the TOSO. It's not sure yet if you have to give a statement about your earnings or about your assets. If it's they will be out of the state, out of TOSO 2.0. But what is it? What will be applicable is a partner income test. So that's a very new obligation. At the TOSO 1.0, government said, well, we are adopting this scheme very quickly, and then we will not do the partner income test. So if an entrepreneur earns less than the social minimum, he will be eligible for the TOSO. But now the income of the partner will be included in the test if someone can apply for the TOSO. So the assistance, it's for 3 months. It's a compensation and will be examined after this period if the entrepreneur was indeed entitled to this assistance. The benefit will be 1,500 euros for a married couple, or a little bit over 1,000 euros for a single person, and this is a net amounts. But please be aware it's that the partner income test will be applied, so the household income must be below the social minimum for the TOSO 2.0. There's also a possibility for a loan that's exactly the same as in the TOSO 1.0, so that the entrepreneur can apply for this new loan. So the entrepreneur might apply twice. So in the 1.0 and 2.0, the entrepreneur might apply for this loan of a little bit over 10,000 euros. Then the TVL MKB in Dutch, and that's the allowance for permanent costs for the MKB, for the small and middle companies, middle-based companies. It's a contribution, it's an allowance for the permanent costs to a maximum of 20,000 euros for 3 months, and that maximum is based, will be based on criteria is for the loss of turnover and also the size of the company and also of the permanent costs. So, but it's a maximum of 20,000 euros for 3 months. The turnover loss must be over 30% for the company. So that's a new threshold. More than 30% turnover loss must be applicable before the company is eligible for this TVL MKB, for the allowance for the assistance for permanent costs for the MKB. The allowance is tax-free, so it's 20,000 euro max tax-free, and also it's will be the government, the central government said, well, explore with local authorities what extra measures can be taken for companies which will face a difficult period after the 1st of September. So make arrangements with your local authorities, and local authorities, please be gentle for those companies and give them extra possibilities. For instance, longer opening hours for a shop, or for bars that they can have longer opening hours, or more space for the terraces, something like that. And also for other companies, get in touch with the local authorities to see if extra measures can be taken for companies will have faced challenging times after the 1st of September. That's about it for us. Thank you for joining us. Maybe see you next time in a webinar or somewhere else. And thanks for being here today with us. Bye-bye.